In the unforgiving wilderness of 1880's Arizona Territory, where survival meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming food for vultures, few men dared to venture alone into Apache lands. But, when 26-year-old cattle rancher Jake Morrison heard the agonized screams echoing through Red Rock Canyon on that fateful October morning, he never imagined that his decision to investigate would lead him into a web of honor, tradition, and unexpected love that would forever change the course of two cultures destined for conflict. What started as a simple act of human compassion would spiral into a diplomatic crisis that reached the governor's office, challenged century-old Apache customs, and forced a hardened cowboy to choose between the life he knew and a future he never dared imagine. This is the true story of how one moment of courage in the wilderness became a bridge between two worlds, proving that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can reshape the destiny of entire communities. The morning that changed everything began like any other, with Jake checking his cattle near the treacherous borderlands where few white men had ever returned alive. Little did he know that before the sun set again, he would be sitting in the lodge of Chief Standing Bear, listening to words that would make him question everything he believed about duty, honor, and the meaning of family. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as his horse picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain of Red Rock Canyon. The October sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona Territory, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made the distant mesas dance like mirages. At 26, Jake had already spent 8 years working cattle in this harsh land, but he never grew tired of its raw beauty. The red sandstone cliffs rose like ancient sentinels around him, their faces carved by millions of years of wind and rain into fantastic shapes that reminded him of castles and cathedrals. His father's ranch, the Double M, sprawled across 15,000 acres of the most challenging terrain in the territory. Most folks thought old Samuel Morrison was crazy for trying to raise cattle in such unforgiving country, but Jake knew better. The grass that grew in the hidden valleys was sweet and nutritious, fed by underground springs that never failed even in the driest years. The trick was finding those secret places and keeping the cattle safe from the predators that roamed these canyons. Jake rode his favorite mount, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, whose sure footing had saved his life more times than he could count. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, alert for any sign of danger. In this country, danger could come in many forms. Mountain lions prowled the high ledges, searching for easy prey. Rattlesnakes sunned themselves on the warm rocks, ready to strike at anything that came too close. And, always, there was the possibility of encountering Apache warriors who considered this land their ancestral home and had little love for the white settlers who had moved in with their cattle and claims of ownership. The relationship between the ranchers and the Apache had been tense for decades. Treaties had been signed and broken, promises made and forgotten. Many of the Apache had been forced onto reservations, but some bands still roamed free, living the old ways and raiding when they needed supplies or when their anger at the encroaching white world grew too strong to contain. Jake had learned to respect the Apache as skilled warriors and survivors, even as he feared them. His father had taught him that in this country, mutual respect was often the only thing standing between peace and bloodshed. As Jake guided Thunder along a narrow trail that wound between towering rock formations, his mind wandered to the upcoming winter preparations. The cattle were in good condition after a summer of good grass and plentiful water, but he needed to move them down from the high country before the first snows began to fall. The weather in Arizona could be treacherous in the winter months. What seemed like a mild day could quickly turn deadly when a blue norther came sweeping down from the mountains, bringing freezing rain and snow that could trap man and beast alike. His reverie was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. From somewhere ahead came a scream of pure agony, raw and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls like the cry of a soul in torment. Thunder's ears shot forward, and the horse pranced nervously beneath him. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip as he strained to listen. The scream came again, weaker this time but still filled with pain and desperation. Every instinct told him to turn around and ride away as fast as Thunder could carry him. In this country, screams usually meant trouble of the worst kind. It could be a trap set by Apache warriors, using an injured man as bait to lure unwary travelers into an ambush. It could be a mountain lion feeding on its prey, and the big cats were known to be especially dangerous when protecting a kill. Or it could be exactly what it sounded like, a human being in desperate need of help. Jake sat frozen in his saddle for a long moment, weighing his options. The sensible thing to do would be to ride back to the ranch and get help. But, by the time he could return with other men, whoever was making those sounds would likely be dead. The screams were growing weaker, and Jake could hear the desperation in them. This was someone fighting for their life, and time was running out. His father had always taught him that a man's character was revealed not in the easy moments, but in the hard choices when no one was watching. Samuel Morrison had drilled into his son the code of the West: you help those in need, regardless of the risk to yourself. It was what separated civilized men from the savages, his father claimed. Though Jake had come to question some of his father's views about who exactly were the savages in this harsh land, the core principle remained sound. Taking a deep breath, Jake urged thunder forward, following the sound of the cries. The trail wound deeper into the canyon, passing between massive boulders that had tumbled down from the cliffs above in some ancient earthquake. The walls grew higher and closer together, creating a narrow passage that would be nearly impossible to escape from if it proved to be a trap. Jake's nerves were stretched tight as piano wire, and his hand never left his gun. As he rounded a sharp bend in the trail, Jake finally saw the source of the screams. About 50 yards ahead, in a small clearing beside a trickling stream, a massive figure was trapped in what appeared to be a bear trap. The man was enormous, even by frontier standards, probably standing close to 6.5 feet tall with broad shoulders and powerful arms that spoke of a lifetime of hard physical work. He was clearly Apache, dressed in traditional buckskins and moccasins, with long black hair braided with feathers and beads. The steel jaws of the trap had closed around the man's right leg just above the ankle, and the powerful spring mechanism held him fast. Blood soaked the ground around the trap, telling Jake that the man had been struggling for some time. The Apache's face was twisted in pain, but his eyes blazed with the fury of a trapped wolf. When he saw Jake approaching, those eyes filled with something between hope and suspicion. Jake had never seen a trap quite like this one. It was larger and more powerful than the beaver traps he was familiar with, clearly designed to hold something much bigger and stronger. The chain attached to it disappeared into a pile of rocks, suggesting that it had been carefully concealed and anchored. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately set this trap, though whether for man or beast was unclear. The Apache warrior spoke in his native language, a rapid stream of words that Jake couldn't understand but whose meaning seemed clear enough. The man was in agony, and the trap was slowly crushing his leg. If Jake didn't act soon, gangrene would set in, and the warrior would face a slow, agonizing death. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and making no sudden movements. The Apache watched him with the intensity of a hawk, ready to fight even in his desperate condition. Jake had heard stories of wounded Apache warriors who continued to battle even while bleeding to death, their courage and determination the stuff of legend. He had no desire to test those stories firsthand. Moving closer, Jake could see that the trap's jaws had bitten deep into the man's leg. The heavy steel teeth had not broken the bone, but they had torn through muscle and sinew, creating wounds that would require immediate attention if the man was to keep his leg. The Apache's breathing was labored, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that spoke of significant blood loss. Jake examined the trap mechanism carefully. It was a complex piece of work, clearly made by a skilled blacksmith. The spring was incredibly powerful, and the release mechanism was designed to prevent accidental opening. Whoever had made this trap had intended it to hold its prey until they could return to claim it. The thought sent a chill down Jake's spine. He had heard rumors of men who hunted other men for sport or profit, but he had never expected to encounter such evil firsthand. Working the release mechanism required precise timing and considerable strength. Jake would need to compress the spring while simultaneously working the release catch, all while the Apache warrior watched him with those intense dark eyes. One mistake could result in the jaws snapping shut even tighter, potentially severing the man's leg completely. Jake tried to communicate through gestures, pointing to the trap and miming his intended actions. The Apache seemed to understand, and he braced himself for what he knew would be intense pain. Jake positioned himself carefully, getting the best leverage possible on the trap mechanism. He took several deep breaths, knowing that he would only get one chance to do this right. With a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, Jake threw his full weight and strength against the trap mechanism. The powerful spring fought him every inch of the way, but gradually the steel jaws began to open. The Apache warrior gritted his teeth and remained perfectly still, understanding that any movement might cause Jake to lose his grip and allow the trap to snap shut again. For what seemed like an eternity, Jake struggled with the mechanism. His muscles strained against the spring tension, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool air in the canyon. Just when he thought his strength might give out, the release catch finally clicked into place, and the jaws sprang open. The Apache's leg was free. The warrior immediately tried to stand, but his injured leg collapsed under him, and he fell heavily to the ground. Jake could see that the leg was badly damaged, with deep puncture wounds that were bleeding freely. Without immediate medical attention, infection was almost certain, and the man could easily lose the limb or his life. Jake quickly retrieved his saddlebags and pulled out the medical supplies he always carried when riding in dangerous country. The kit was basic but adequate for treating most injuries a man might encounter in the wilderness. He had learned field medicine from an old cavalry surgeon who had taken refuge at the M after being drummed out of the army for drinking. The man had been a drunk, but he knew his trade, and he had taught Jake well. Working quickly but carefully, Jake cleaned the wounds with water from his canteen and began applying bandages to stop the bleeding. The Apache warrior endured the treatment stoically, though Jake could see the pain in his eyes. As he worked, Jake began to appreciate the sheer size and power of the man he was treating. The warrior's muscles were like iron cords under his skin, and, even injured, he radiated a sense of controlled strength that was both impressive and slightly intimidating. As Jake tied off the last bandage, the Apache warrior spoke again, this time in broken English. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Though his words were limited, the meaning was clear enough. He was expressing gratitude, but also studying Jake with new interest. The warrior seemed surprised that a white man would risk his life to help an Apache, especially one found in such suspicious circumstances. Jake helped the warrior to his feet, supporting his weight as they tested whether the injured leg could bear any weight at all. It was immediately clear that walking would be impossible without assistance. The trap had done significant damage to the muscles and tendons, and even with proper medical treatment, it would be weeks before the man could walk normally again. The practical problem of what to do next weighed heavily on Jake's mind. He couldn't simply leave the wounded warrior here to die, but bringing an Apache to his father's ranch would create enormous complications. The relationship between the Morrison family and the local Apache bands was tense at best, and many of the ranch hands would not look kindly on harboring what they would see as a potential enemy. As if reading his thoughts, the Apache warrior pointed toward the north, in the direction of the Mogollon Rim where the mountain Apache made their strongholds. He spoke a few words in English, mixed with Apache phrases that Jake couldn't understand. But the general meaning seemed to be that his people were not far away, and that Jake should take him to them. The suggestion filled Jake with both relief and terror. Riding into an Apache camp would be incredibly dangerous for a white man, even one who had just saved a warrior's life. Apache justice was swift and final, and they had little reason to trust any white man. On the other hand, leaving the wounded warrior here was essentially condemning him to death, and Jake's conscience wouldn't allow that. As Jake pondered his options, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Both men froze, listening intently to determine whether the riders were friend or foe. The Apache warrior's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, even though he was in no condition to fight. Jake loosened his pistol in its holster and moved to a position where he could see the trail while keeping one eye on his wounded companion. The riders came into view around the bend, and Jake's heart sank. There were 4 of them, all white men, all heavily armed, and all wearing the rough clothes of frontier hard cases. The kind of men who made their living through violence and intimidation. The leader was a tall, lean man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth, wearing a black hat pulled low over his forehead. Jake recognized the type immediately, men who had drifted west after the war, unable to settle into peaceful life and always looking for the next opportunity to profit from other people's misery. The leader's eyes took in the scene quickly, noting the open trap, the wounded Apache, and Jake's defensive posture. A slow smile spread across his face, but it held no warmth or humor. It was the smile of a predator who had found unexpected prey. The man spoke in a voice like gravel, addressing Jake while keeping his eyes on the Apache warrior. His words confirmed Jake's worst fears. These men were bounty hunters, and they had set the trap specifically to capture Apache warriors alive. The territorial government was offering substantial rewards for the capture of Apache leaders, particularly those who had refused to go to the reservations. Dead or alive, the posters said, but alive was worth more money. The leader explained that the wounded warrior was known to them as Stone Bear, a war chief who had been raiding settlements along the border. The bounty on his head was substantial, enough to keep the 4 men in whiskey and women for months. They had tracked him to this canyon and set their trap, expecting to return in the morning to find their prize waiting for them. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process this information. The man he had just risked his life to save was apparently a wanted fugitive, a war chief responsible for attacks on innocent settlers. Everything his father had taught him about right and wrong seemed to be colliding in this moment. Should he step aside and let these bounty hunters claim their prize? Or should he continue to protect a man who had shown him nothing but dignity and courage, regardless of what crimes he might have committed? The bounty hunters seemed to assume that Jake would cooperate with them, perhaps even expecting a share of the reward for his assistance. They dismounted casually, their weapons ready but not yet drawn. The leader approached Jake with the confidence of a man who expected no resistance from a simple cowboy who had merely stumbled into their operation. But, as Jake looked into Stone Bear's eyes, he saw something that decided the matter for him. There was no plea for help, no begging for mercy. The Apache warrior was prepared to face whatever fate awaited him with the same stoic courage he had shown while trapped. But there was also a flicker of something else, a look that seemed to say that he had not expected kindness from a white man and would not forget it easily. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He stepped between the bounty hunters and Stone Bear, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. His voice was steady when he spoke, though his heart was pounding like a war drum in his chest. Jake told the bounty hunters that they would have to go through him to get to the Apache. He explained that he had given his word to help the wounded man, and that word meant something to him even if it meant nothing to men like them. The leader's smile widened, but his eyes turned cold and dangerous. He pointed out that Jake was outnumbered 4-1 and that his misplaced compassion was about to get him killed. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel Stone Bear watching him with new interest, perhaps beginning to understand that this white cowboy was willing to risk his life for a man he had never met before. The bounty hunters spread out slightly, positioning themselves for a fight while trying to appear casual about it. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed right then, but the sound of more horses approaching from the north changed everything. These new riders were Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, armed and painted for war. They had apparently been tracking Stone Bear and had followed his trail to this canyon. Now they sat their horses on the rim above, looking down at the scene below with eyes like black diamonds. The bounty hunters suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in the same canyon where they had hoped to trap their prey. Their confidence evaporated like morning dew, replaced by the stark fear of men who knew they were about to die unless something miraculous happened. The leader's hand moved toward his gun, but he stopped when he realized that drawing would only hasten their deaths. Stone Bear called out to his warriors in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably that of a commander giving orders to his men. The warriors listened intently, their faces impassive as stone masks. When Stone Bear finished speaking, one of the younger warriors responded, and what followed was clearly a rapid exchange of information. The Apache warriors began descending into the canyon, moving with the fluid grace of men who had spent their entire lives in this terrain. They surrounded the bounty hunters quickly and efficiently, their weapons ready but not yet threatening. It was clear that they were waiting for orders from Stone Bear, despite his wounded condition. Jake found himself in the strange position of being the only white man present who was not an immediate target for Apache justice. Stone Bear spoke to him again in his limited English, gesturing toward the bounty hunters and, then, toward the trap that had nearly cost him his leg. The meaning was clear enough. The Apache chief was asking Jake what should be done with the men who had tried to capture him. The responsibility of that decision weighed heavily on Jake's shoulders. By the laws of the frontier, the bounty hunters had every right to pursue wanted fugitives and claim the rewards offered by the territorial government. But, by the older laws of human decency, their methods were barbaric and their motives purely mercenary. They had shown no concern for Stone Bear's suffering and would have left him to die slowly if it suited their purposes. Jake looked at each of the bounty hunters in turn, seeing the fear in their eyes but also the calculation. These were hard men who lived by violence and would not hesitate to kill him if the situation were reversed. The leader was still watching for any opportunity to turn the tables, his hand hovering near his weapon despite the overwhelming odds against him. When Jake finally spoke, his words surprised everyone present. He suggested that the bounty hunters be allowed to leave, but only after surrendering their weapons and promising never to return to Apache lands. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but might prevent unnecessary bloodshed. The Apache could have their revenge by humiliating their enemies rather than killing them, and the bounty hunters would escape with their lives if not their dignity. Stone Bear listened to Jake's suggestion with interest, his dark eyes studying the young cowboy's face as if trying to read his soul. After a long moment, he nodded slowly and spoke to his warriors. The Apache began disarming the bounty hunters, taking their guns, knives, and ammunition while allowing them to keep their horses and basic supplies for the journey back to civilization. The leader of the bounty hunters glared at Jake with pure hatred, clearly blaming him for the loss of both their prey and their weapons. As he mounted his horse, he promised that this wasn't over, that Jake would regret interfering with their business. But his threats rang hollow in the face of the Apache warriors who watched his every move with predatory attention. As the bounty hunters rode away, their pride and their weapons left behind, Jake realized that he had just made enemies who would not forget or forgive what had happened here. But he also realized that he had acted according to his own moral code, regardless of the consequences. His father had taught him that a man's word was his bond, and he had given his word to help Stone Bear. The Apache warriors gathered around their wounded chief, speaking rapidly in their own language. Jake could see the respect and affection they had for Stone Bear, the way they looked to him for guidance even in his injured state. Whatever crimes he might have committed against white settlers, it was clear that he was a beloved leader among his own people. Stone Bear spoke to Jake again, this time with what seemed to be formal ceremony in his voice. Though Jake couldn't understand all the words, he sensed that something important was happening. The Apache chief seemed to be making some kind of pronouncement or declaration, and the other warriors listened with solemn attention. One of the younger warriors, who spoke better English than Stone Bear, stepped forward to translate. He explained that Stone Bear had declared Jake to be a friend of the Apache people, a man of honor who had proven himself willing to risk his life for justice and mercy. It was a recognition that carried both privilege and responsibility, the warrior explained. Jake would always be welcome in Apache lands, but he would also be held to the highest standards of behavior. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, Jake found himself facing a choice he had never anticipated. Stone Bear needed proper medical treatment for his injured leg, the kind of care that could only be provided in the Apache strongholds high in the mountains. The warrior's own people could tend to his wounds with their traditional healing methods, but the journey to reach them would be difficult and dangerous for a man in his condition. The Apache chief had made it clear that Jake was welcome to accompany them, but such a journey would take him deep into territory where no white man had ever traveled safely. It would mean leaving his father's ranch unattended, abandoning his responsibilities, and venturing into a world where the rules he had grown up with no longer applied. But it would also mean ensuring that Stone Bear received the care he needed and perhaps learning something about the Apache people that few white men had ever had the opportunity to discover. As Jake weighed his decision, he looked up at the canyon walls that surrounded them, painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. This harsh and beautiful land had shaped both the Apache and the white settlers who now called it home, but it had not yet taught them how to share it peacefully. Perhaps, Jake thought, understanding could only come through the kind of direct contact that most men from both cultures avoided. The Apache warriors were preparing to move out, fashioning a travois to carry their wounded chief. They worked with quiet efficiency, their movements coordinated by years of shared experience. Jake watched them with growing admiration for their skill and dedication to their leader. These were not the savage raiders described in the territorial newspapers, but men bound together by loyalty and tradition, doing what they believed necessary to protect their way of life. Stone Bear called Jake over to where he lay on the makeshift stretcher. The Apache chief's eyes were bright with fever, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Through the young warrior who served as translator, he made Jake an offer that would change everything. He invited Jake not just to accompany them to their mountain stronghold, but to remain there as his guest for the winter months. It was an unprecedented honor, the translator explained, one that had never been extended to a white man before. The offer came with conditions, of course. Jake would have to live by Apache law while in their territory, respecting their customs and traditions even when they conflicted with his own upbringing. He would be expected to contribute to the welfare of the community, using whatever skills he possessed to help ensure their survival through the harsh mountain winter. And, most importantly, he would be sworn to secrecy about the location and defenses of their stronghold, information that could be used against them by their enemies. Jake's mind raced as he considered the implications of Stone Bear's offer. Accepting would mean abandoning his father's ranch during the crucial winter months when the cattle would need constant attention. It would mean leaving behind everything familiar and safe to enter a world where his very presence might be seen as a threat by some Apache who had not witnessed the events of this day. But it would also mean the chance to prevent future conflicts through understanding, to build bridges between two peoples who seemed destined for endless warfare. As darkness began to fall across the canyon, Jake made his decision. He would accept Stone Bear's invitation, but first he needed to return to the Double M to make arrangements for the ranch's care during his absence. He could trust his father's foreman, Miguel Santos, to handle the day-to-day operations, and the winter months were traditionally quiet anyway. The cattle would be moved to the lower pastures where they could find shelter from the worst of the weather, and most of the hands would drift south to find work until spring brought them back. Stone Bear accepted Jake's terms with a slow nod, understanding the responsibilities that bound a man to his family's land. They agreed that Jake would meet the Apache band at a designated location in 3 days' time, giving him enough time to ride back to the ranch and make his preparations. The young warrior who served as translator would guide Jake to the meeting place when he was ready. As the Apache prepared to depart, carrying their wounded chief toward the distant mountains, Jake mounted Thunder and began the long ride back to the Double M. The events of the day played through his mind like scenes from a fever dream. In the space of a few hours, he had saved a man's life, faced down bounty hunters, been accepted as a friend by Apache warriors, and committed himself to a winter journey into the unknown. It was enough to make a man question his sanity, but Jake felt a strange sense of rightness about the path he had chosen. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky as Jake rode through the familiar landscape toward home. He thought about how he would explain his decision to his father, a man whose views on the Apache had been shaped by decades of conflict and mistrust. Samuel Morrison was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and he would struggle to understand why his son would risk everything to help people he had been taught to see as enemies. But, as Thunder's hooves rang against the rocky trail, carrying them steadily homeward, Jake knew that some decisions could not be explained by practical logic alone. Sometimes a man had to follow his conscience even when it led him into uncharted territory. And sometimes the most important journeys began not with careful planning, but with a single moment of choosing to do what felt right rather than what felt safe. The Double M ranch house sat like a fortress against the desert landscape, its thick adobe walls and heavy wooden shutters designed to withstand both the elements and hostile attacks. As Jake rode through the main gate in the pre-dawn darkness, the familiar sight of home filled him with both comfort and dread. Oil lamps glowed in the windows of the main house, telling him that his father was already awake and probably wondering where his son had spent the night. Thunder's hooves clattered on the packed earth of the courtyard as Jake dismounted and led his horse toward the barn. The ranch hands would be stirring soon, preparing for another day of hard work under the Arizona sun. Miguel Santos, the foreman, emerged from the bunkhouse as Jake approached, his weathered face creased with concern. Miguel had worked for the Morrison family for 15 years, ever since Samuel had found him half-dead from thirst in the desert, and his loyalty was absolute. Miguel spoke in rapid Spanish, asking where Jake had been and whether there had been trouble. His sharp eyes noted the condition of Thunder's coat, the way the horse's breathing suggested a long, hard ride, and the tension in Jake's posture that spoke of recent danger. Miguel had fought in too many skirmishes with Apache raiders not to recognize the signs of a man who had encountered more than he bargained for. Jake assured Miguel that he was unharmed, but he could see that the older man was not entirely convinced. Miguel had an almost supernatural ability to read the moods and intentions of both horses and men, a skill that had kept him alive through decades of frontier life. He would know that something significant had happened, even if Jake chose not to share the details immediately. After seeing to Thunder's care, Jake walked slowly toward the main house, rehearsing in his mind the conversation he was about to have with his father. Samuel Morrison was a fair man but a hard one, shaped by 30 years of carving a life out of the unforgiving Arizona territory. He had fought Apache raiders, Mexican bandits, and drought with equal determination, never backing down from a fight when he believed he was in the right. Explaining why his son wanted to spend the winter in an Apache stronghold would require all of Jake's powers of persuasion. The main house was built in the traditional Spanish colonial style, with thick walls that kept the interior cool during the blazing summer days and warm during the cold desert nights. Samuel Morrison sat at the heavy oak table that dominated the kitchen, a cup of coffee steaming before him and yesterday's newspaper spread out beside his plate. At 54, he remained a powerful man, his shoulders still broad beneath his work shirt, his hands calloused from decades of ranch work. His gray eyes looked up as Jake entered, taking in his son's appearance with the sharp attention of a man accustomed to reading danger signs. Samuel's greeting was calm but pointed, asking where Jake had spent the night and whether the cattle in the north pastures were secure. There was no accusation in his voice, but Jake could hear the underlying worry. In this country, a man who didn't come home when expected might never come home at all, and Samuel had buried too many friends not to fear the worst when his son disappeared without explanation. Jake poured himself coffee from the pot that always sat warming on the wood stove and took a seat across from his father. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows illuminated the lined face that bore witness to 3 decades of frontier hardship. Samuel Morrison was not a man who frightened easily, but Jake could see the tension in his posture as he waited for his son's explanation. Taking a deep breath, Jake began to tell his story, starting with the discovery of the trapped Apache warrior and ending with Stone Bear's invitation to winter in the mountain stronghold. He spoke carefully and honestly, knowing that any attempt to minimize the significance of what had happened would be immediately detected by his father's keen intelligence. Samuel listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts, but Jake could see the storm building behind those gray eyes. When Jake finished speaking, silence filled the kitchen like smoke from a doused fire. Samuel stared into his coffee cup as if seeking answers in its dark depths, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic as if drawing warmth from it. Outside, the sounds of the ranch coming to life could be heard, the voices of the hands as they began their morning chores, the lowing of cattle in the distant pastures, the familiar rhythms of a working ranch that had been Samuel's life's work. Samuel's response, when it finally came, was measured but filled with barely controlled emotion. He reminded Jake of the history between their family and the Apache, the raids that had cost them livestock and nearly cost them their lives on several occasions. He spoke of neighbors who had been killed or driven from their homes, of the constant vigilance required to survive in a land where peace was always fragile and violence always lurking just beyond the horizon. The older man rose from the table and walked to the window that overlooked the main pasture, where 100 head of prime cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. These animals represented years of back-breaking work, careful breeding, and calculated risks. They were the foundation of the Morrison family's future, the legacy that Samuel hoped to leave to his son and any grandchildren who might follow. The thought of abandoning this responsibility to chase after some romantic notion of Indian friendship was almost more than he could bear. Jake understood his father's concerns, but he also recognized that this was about more than just the ranch or even family loyalty. Samuel Morrison had built his life on the belief that strength and determination could overcome any obstacle, that a man who worked hard and stayed true to his principles would eventually triumph over adversity. The idea that his son might find common ground with people he had been taught to see as enemies challenged those fundamental beliefs in ways that were deeply unsettling. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult either man had ever experienced. Samuel pointed out the practical problems with Jake's plan, the impossibility of learning enough about Apache customs in a few months to avoid giving offense, the risk of being seen as a spy or a threat despite Stone Bear's protection. He reminded his son that even well-intentioned actions could have disastrous consequences when they involved peoples whose worldviews were so fundamentally different. Jake countered by describing what he had witnessed in the canyon, the dignity and courage that Stone Bear had displayed even while trapped and helpless, the loyalty of the warriors who had come to rescue their chief, the respect they had shown for Jake's own courage in standing up to the bounty hunters. He argued that understanding between the two peoples was possible, but only if someone was willing to take the first step toward building trust. The argument raged for over an hour, with both men holding firmly to their positions while trying to understand the other's perspective. Samuel was not a cruel or prejudiced man, but his experiences had taught him that survival in this harsh land required clear lines between friend and enemy, ally and threat. Jake's idealism seemed dangerous to him, a luxury that could get his son killed and destroy everything the Morrison family had worked to build. But, as the morning wore on, something in Jake's voice began to penetrate his father's defenses. Samuel could hear the conviction in his son's words, the sense of moral certainty that reminded him of his own younger self, when he had first come to Arizona territory with dreams of building something lasting and good in the wilderness. Perhaps, Samuel thought, this was simply how each generation had to find its own way, by taking risks that their elders considered foolish but that might lead to a better future. Miguel Santos appeared in the kitchen doorway as the argument reached its peak, his hat in his hands and worry written across his weathered features. He had been listening from the courtyard, understanding enough of the English to grasp the general nature of the discussion. As foreman of the Double M, Miguel had a stake in whatever decision was made, and his opinion carried considerable weight with both Morrison men. Miguel spoke carefully, switching between English and Spanish as he shared his own perspective on the situation. He had fought against the Apache in his younger days, but he had also worked alongside Navajo and Hopi ranch hands who had taught him that not all Indians were enemies. He pointed out that Jake was a grown man who had already proven his courage and judgment in difficult situations. Perhaps, Miguel suggested, this was an opportunity to build understanding that could benefit everyone in the long run. Samuel looked at his foreman with surprise, not having expected such support for his son's plan. Miguel's opinion mattered because it was grounded in practical experience rather than idealistic dreams. If Miguel believed that Jake could survive such an adventure and possibly even accomplish something useful, then perhaps the idea was not as foolish as it initially seemed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Doc Harrison, the territorial circuit doctor who made regular visits to the outlying ranches to tend to injuries and illnesses that were beyond the scope of basic frontier medicine. Doc Harrison was a small, neat man in his 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had served as an army surgeon during the Civil War and had seen enough human suffering to develop a philosophical approach to life that valued understanding over conflict. Doc Harrison listened to Jake's story with the same careful attention he gave to his patient's symptoms, asking pointed questions about Stone Bear's injuries and the medical treatment he would need. The doctor's professional opinion was that the Apache chief would survive his wounds, but that proper care during the healing process would be crucial to prevent infection and ensure that he regained full use of his leg. More importantly, Doc Harrison offered a perspective on the situation that neither Jake nor Samuel had considered. He pointed out that establishing friendly relations with Apache leaders could have significant benefits for the entire territory. Medical knowledge could be shared between the two cultures, with Apache healing techniques potentially offering treatments for conditions that conventional medicine struggled to address. Trade relationships could develop, reducing the economic pressures that often led to raiding and conflict. The doctor's words carried weight because they came from a man whose primary concern was healing rather than politics or profit. Doc Harrison had treated wounded men from both sides of the Apache conflicts, and his experience had taught him that suffering was universal, regardless of race or culture. If Jake's adventure could lead to reduced violence and better understanding, then the doctor was inclined to support it. As the day progressed, word of Jake's plan began to spread among the ranch hands, generating heated discussions in the bunkhouse and around the corrals. Some of the men were openly skeptical, questioning the wisdom of trusting Apache promises and wondering whether Jake might be walking into a trap. Others were intrigued by the novelty of the situation, seeing it as the kind of bold adventure that defined life on the frontier. Tom Bradley, one of the older hands who had worked for the Morrison family since its early days, was particularly vocal in his opposition to the plan. Tom had lost a brother to Apache raiders 10 years earlier, and his hatred for all Indians was both deep and personal. He argued that Jake was being naive, that the Apache would never truly accept a white man as anything more than a temporary curiosity, and that the whole venture was likely to end in tragedy. But Maria Santos, Miguel's wife and the ranch's cook, offered a different perspective. Maria was part Apache herself, though she rarely spoke of her heritage, and her insights carried special weight with the other Mexican workers on the ranch. She pointed out that Apache culture placed enormous value on personal honor and the fulfillment of obligations. If Stone Bear had truly declared Jake to be a friend of the Apache people, then that declaration would be honored by all members of the band, regardless of their personal feelings about white settlers. The debate continued throughout the day as Jake made his preparations for the journey. He selected his warmest clothes, knowing that the mountain stronghold would be cold even in the milder months of winter. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, understanding that while he hoped never to use them, being properly armed was essential for survival in the wilderness. Most importantly, he wrote detailed instructions for the care of the ranch during his absence, covering everything from feeding schedules to emergency procedures. Samuel Morrison spent the day in uncharacteristic silence, riding out to check on the cattle but spending most of his time simply staring at the vast landscape that had defined his adult life. The decision his son was making would change their relationship forever, regardless of its outcome. If Jake survived his winter with the Apache, he would return as a different man, one with experiences and perspectives that his father could never fully share. And if he didn't survive, Samuel would live with the knowledge that their last conversation had been an argument. As evening approached, father and son found themselves alone together in the ranch house kitchen once again. The afternoon had given both men time to think, and the anger that had marked their morning conversation had been replaced by a deeper understanding of what was at stake. Samuel still believed that his son was taking an enormous risk, but he had come to realize that some risks were necessary for growth and change. Samuel's final words to his son were both a blessing and a warning. He reminded Jake that he would always have a home at the Double M, regardless of what happened during his stay with the Apache. But he also made it clear that Jake would be representing not just himself but his entire family and community during his time in the stronghold. Any mistake, any breach of Apache customs or expectations, could have consequences that extended far beyond one young man's adventure. Jake promised his father that he would conduct himself with honor and dignity, that he would respect Apache customs while remaining true to his own principles. It was a difficult balance to maintain, but Jake believed that it was possible for people of different cultures to find common ground without abandoning their own identities. The next few months would test that belief in ways that no amount of preparation could anticipate. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains that reminded everyone that winter was approaching fast. Jake saddled Thunder and loaded his pack animals with supplies for the journey, including gifts that Miguel had suggested might be appropriate for Apache hosts. Maria Santos had prepared special foods that would travel well and provide nutrition during the difficult days ahead. The entire ranch community gathered in the courtyard to see Jake off, a mixture of admiration, concern, and curiosity evident on their faces. Some of the hands shook his hand and wished him luck, while others simply nodded their acknowledgement of his courage. Tom Bradley remained conspicuously absent, his disapproval of the venture too strong to allow him to participate in what he saw as a farewell to folly. Miguel Santos would accompany Jake to the meeting point that had been agreed upon with Stone Bear's warriors, both to ensure safe passage through the dangerous borderlands and to serve as a witness to the beginning of this unprecedented adventure. The foreman's presence would also provide a last opportunity for Jake to change his mind if he decided that the risks were too great. As the small party rode out from the Double M, Jake looked back at the ranch buildings one final time, fixing the image in his memory. The low adobe structures, the windmill turning lazily in the breeze, the cattle scattered across the pastures, all of it represented security and familiarity that he was choosing to leave behind. There was no guarantee that he would see any of it again, and that knowledge filled him with both sadness and excitement. The ride to the meeting point took them through some of the most spectacular and dangerous country in Arizona territory. Red sandstone canyons gave way to pine forests as they climbed toward the high country, and the air grew thin and sharp with the promise of snow. Jake had ridden this country before, but never with the knowledge that he was crossing over from one world into another, leaving behind everything he had known to embrace an uncertain future. Miguel proved to be excellent company during the journey, sharing stories of his own adventures and misadventures during his years in the territory. The older man's perspective helped Jake understand that what he was undertaking was not entirely unprecedented. Men had always been crossing cultural boundaries in the Southwest, learning new languages, adopting new customs, finding ways to survive and thrive in circumstances their fathers could never have imagined. As they approached the designated meeting place, a small meadow beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, Jake felt his nervousness increasing. The next few hours would determine whether Stone Bear's promise of protection and welcome would be honored by his warriors, or whether Jake was riding into a situation that he couldn't control. The fact that Miguel would be turning back at this point meant that Jake would be entirely dependent on Apache goodwill from here forward. The Apache warriors were already waiting when Jake and Miguel arrived at the meadow. They sat their horses with the patient stillness of men accustomed to long watches, their weapons visible but not threatening. Jake recognized the young warrior who had served as translator during the confrontation with the bounty hunters, and the man's slight nod of acknowledgement was reassuring. Stone Bear himself was not present, having been taken directly to the mountain stronghold for medical treatment, but his instructions had clearly been explicit. The warriors greeted Jake with formal courtesy, and the translator explained that they were honored to escort him to their winter camps. The ceremony of the moment was not lost on Jake, who understood that he was participating in something that had never happened before in the long and troubled relationship between Apache and white settlers. Miguel's farewell was brief but emotional. The two men had developed a friendship over the years that transcended the formal relationship between employer and employee, and Miguel's concern for Jake's welfare was genuine and deep. The foreman's final words were a reminder that courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act rightly despite being afraid. As Miguel rode back toward the Double M, Jake found himself alone with the Apache warriors for the first time. The transition from his familiar world to theirs was marked by subtle changes in the way they traveled, the routes they chose, the signs they watched for, and the precautions they took. Jake realized that he was beginning an education that would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, leadership, and community. The journey to the mountain stronghold took 3 days of hard riding through increasingly rugged terrain. The Apache horses seemed to find footing where Jake would have sworn no horse could go, and their riders moved with a fluid grace that spoke of lifelong familiarity with this harsh landscape. Jake did his best to keep up, though he could see that his presence slowed the party considerably. During rest breaks and around the evening campfires, Jake began to learn his first words of the Apache language and to understand the complex social relationships that bound the warriors together. The translator, whose name was Running Wolf, proved to be an excellent teacher, patiently correcting Jake's pronunciation and explaining the cultural context behind various phrases and concepts. The Apache approach to hospitality was both generous and formal, with specific protocols that governed everything from the sharing of food to the arrangement of sleeping areas. Jake quickly learned that violating these customs, even through ignorance, could give serious offense. But he also discovered that his obvious efforts to learn and respect Apache ways were appreciated by his hosts, who seemed genuinely curious about this white man who had chosen to live among them. On the final day of the journey, as they climbed toward the hidden valley that sheltered the Apache winter camps, Jake got his first glimpse of the stronghold that would be his home for the next several months. It was unlike anything he had expected, a natural fortress surrounded by towering cliffs and accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended. The valley itself was green and fertile, fed by springs that never failed and sheltered from the worst of the mountain weather. The Apache village was larger than Jake had anticipated, with several dozen lodges arranged according to a pattern that reflected both practical considerations and spiritual beliefs. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the open areas between the dwellings, and elders sat in the afternoon sun working on crafts and telling stories. It was, Jake realized, not a war camp but a functioning community where families lived and worked and raised their children according to traditions that stretched back generations. As the party entered the village, Jake became the center of intense but polite attention. Word of his arrival had preceded him, and the entire population had turned out to get their first look at the white man who had saved their war chief's life. Jake felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes studying him, measuring him against whatever expectations they had formed about white settlers and their character. Stone Bear's lodge was located in the center of the village, its position reflecting both his status as a war chief and the need for his warriors to have easy access to his counsel and commands. The chief was resting comfortably when Jake arrived, his injured leg properly splinted and bandaged with materials that showed the sophistication of Apache medical knowledge. Despite his obvious pain, Stone Bear insisted on greeting his guest with full ceremony, rising from his bed to clasp Jake's hand in the traditional manner. The reunion between Stone Bear and his rescuer was marked by formal speeches and the exchange of gifts, with Running Wolf providing translation for the more complex concepts that needed to be communicated. Stone Bear presented Jake with a beautifully crafted knife, its blade made from steel traded from Mexican sources and its handle decorated with intricate beadwork. In return, Jake offered a silver-mounted bridle that had belonged to his grandfather, a gesture that was received with obvious appreciation. As evening fell over the mountain valley, Jake found himself participating in his first Apache feast, a celebration that honored both Stone Bear's safe return and Jake's courage in rescuing him. The food was different from anything he had eaten before, featuring game animals and wild plants that the Apache had harvested from the surrounding mountains. But, more importantly, Jake began to understand the social dynamics that governed Apache community life, the complex relationships between families, clans, and warrior societies that provided structure and meaning to daily existence. The feast was also Jake's introduction to Apache storytelling traditions, as the elders took turns recounting tales that preserved the history and wisdom of their people. Though Jake could understand only a fraction of what was being said, he could feel the power of the stories, the way they connected the present community to its ancestors and provided guidance for future generations. It was his first glimpse into a worldview that was both completely foreign and strangely familiar, grounded in respect for the natural world and the bonds that tied individuals to their communities. As the celebration continued late into the night, Jake realized that he had crossed more than just geographical boundaries in coming to this place. He had entered a world where different values governed human relationships, where different principles guided decision-making, and where different traditions shaped the rhythm of daily life. The next few months would test his ability to adapt to these differences while remaining true to his own character and beliefs. When he finally retired to the lodge that had been prepared for him, Jake lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds of the Apache village settling down for the night. Dogs barked in the distance, children's voices carried on the wind, and somewhere a woman was singing a lullaby in the musical language he was just beginning to understand. It was the beginning of an adventure that would change not only his own life but potentially the relationship between two peoples who had known too much conflict and too little understanding. Jake's first weeks in the Apache stronghold passed like a fever dream of constant learning and adaptation. Each dawn brought new challenges as he struggled to understand not just the language of his hosts, but the complex web of customs, traditions, and unspoken rules that governed every aspect of Apache life. What had seemed like a simple gesture of hospitality gradually revealed itself to be an intricate social contract that bound him to the community in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The mountain valley that served as the Apache winter home was a marvel of natural engineering. Protected by towering cliffs on three sides and accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended, it provided everything needed for a community to survive the harsh mountain winter. Natural springs provided fresh water year-round, while groves of oak and pine offered both shelter and fuel for the fires that would be essential during the coldest months. Stone Bear's recovery progressed slowly but steadily under the care of the tribal medicine women, whose knowledge of healing herbs and techniques impressed Jake with its sophistication and effectiveness. The Apache approach to medicine was holistic, addressing not just the physical injury but the spiritual and emotional aspects of healing as well. Jake watched in fascination as ceremonies were performed to ensure that Stone Bear's spirit remained strong while his body mended, and he began to understand that the Apache saw no separation between physical and spiritual health. Running Wolf continued to serve as Jake's primary teacher and interpreter, but other members of the community gradually began to take an interest in the strange white man who had come to live among them. An elderly woman named Grandmother Spider, whose weathered face spoke of 8 decades of mountain life, appointed herself as Jake's instructor in Apache social customs. Her patience seemed infinite as she corrected his attempts at proper behavior, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, and Jake quickly learned that her approval was essential for acceptance by the community as a whole. The children of the village were initially shy around Jake, having heard stories of white men that painted them as dangerous and unpredictable. But children's natural curiosity eventually overcame their caution, and Jake found himself surrounded by small faces eager to examine his strange clothes, pale skin, and unusual possessions. Their innocent questions, translated by Running Wolf, often revealed assumptions about white culture that were as incorrect as many white assumptions about Apache life. Jake's daily routine was gradually restructured to fit Apache patterns of life. He rose before dawn to participate in the morning prayers that welcomed the sun and asked for guidance through the day ahead. The Apache relationship with the natural world was direct and personal, treating the elements not as resources to be exploited but as relatives to be respected and honored. This perspective challenged Jake's frontier upbringing, which had taught him to see nature as something to be conquered and controlled. The work of preparing for winter was constant and demanding, requiring every member of the community to contribute according to their abilities. Jake quickly discovered that his skills as a horseman and cattleman translated well to Apache tasks, though the methods were often different from what he was accustomed to. The Apache approach to animal husbandry emphasized understanding the natural behavior of their horses and working with their instincts rather than forcing them into submission through dominance. Jake's first real test of acceptance came when he was invited to participate in a hunting expedition led by Gray Fox, one of Stone Bear's most trusted warriors. The hunt was not just about providing meat for the winter stores, but also about maintaining the spiritual relationship between the Apache and the animals that sustained them. Jake struggled to understand the complex rituals that preceded and followed the taking of game, but his obvious efforts to show respect were noted by his companions. The hunting party spent 5 days in the high country, tracking elk through terrain that would have challenged even experienced white hunters. Jake's shooting skills were adequate, but he quickly learned that Apache hunting techniques emphasized patience, observation, and understanding of animal behavior over raw marksmanship. The Apache hunters could read signs in the landscape that were invisible to Jake, interpreting tracks, broken vegetation, and even the behavior of birds to predict where game animals might be found. When the hunt finally succeeded and a large elk was taken, Jake participated in the ceremony that honored the animal's spirit and thanked it for providing sustenance to the community. The ritual was deeply moving, acknowledging the sacred nature of the exchange between predator and prey while ensuring that nothing was wasted. Every part of the elk would be used, from the meat that would feed families through the winter to the hide that would provide clothing and shelter materials. Returning to the village with the hunting party, Jake felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond merely contributing to the food supply. He had proven himself capable of enduring the physical hardships of Apache life while showing respect for their spiritual traditions. The subtle but noticeable change in how other community members treated him told Jake that he had passed an important test and moved closer to genuine acceptance. Stone Bear's influence in Jake's integration into Apache society was both protective and challenging. The war chief made it clear that Jake was under his personal protection, which meant that no one could harm or insult him without answering to Stone Bear himself. But this protection came with expectations. Jake was representing not just himself but Stone Bear's judgment in extending hospitality to a white man. Any failure on Jake's part would reflect poorly on the chief's wisdom and leadership. The conversations between Stone Bear and Jake, mediated by Running Wolf's translation, became increasingly complex as Jake's language skills improved and his understanding of Apache culture deepened. Stone Bear was intensely curious about white society, asking penetrating questions about everything from religious beliefs to political structures. His questions often revealed assumptions about white culture that were as skewed as white assumptions about Apache life, and Jake found himself serving as an informal ambassador for his entire people. One of the most challenging aspects of Apache life for Jake was learning to navigate the complex web of relationships that bound the community together. The Apache kinship system was far more elaborate than anything in white culture, with specific terms and obligations for dozens of different types of relatives. Understanding these relationships was crucial for proper behavior, as the wrong word or gesture could give serious offense to people whose goodwill Jake needed for survival. The arrival of winter in the mountain stronghold was gradual but inexorable. Snow began to dust the highest peaks in early November, and the morning frosts grew heavier with each passing day. The Apache prepared for the harsh months ahead with the methodical efficiency of people who had survived countless mountain winters. Food was preserved, fuel was gathered, and equipment was repaired or replaced as needed. Jake threw himself into the winter preparations, eager to prove his worth to the community that had accepted him. His experience with ranch work translated well to many Apache tasks, though he had to learn new techniques for everything from food preservation to tool making. The Apache methods were often more sophisticated than what he had known, refined by generations of mountain life into highly effective systems for survival in harsh conditions. The winter clothing provided by the Apache women was a revelation to Jake, who had never experienced garments so perfectly adapted to extreme cold. The layered system of buckskin and fur was both warmer and more flexible than anything in his previous experience, and the mukluks made from elk hide and lined with rabbit fur kept his feet warm and dry even in deep snow. Learning to move gracefully in these new clothes took time, but Jake eventually mastered the silent, efficient gait that allowed Apache warriors to travel through snow without exhausting themselves. As winter deepened and the community settled into the rhythm of the cold months, Jake began to understand the social dynamics that sustained Apache life during the most challenging time of the year. The long evenings were filled with storytelling, crafts work, and the teaching of traditions to the younger generation. Jake found himself included in these activities, both as a student learning Apache culture and as a teacher sharing knowledge from his own background. The stories that filled the winter evenings were unlike anything in Jake's experience. Apache oral tradition preserved not just historical events but also spiritual teachings, practical knowledge, and moral lessons in narrative form. The storytellers were artists as well as teachers, using voice, gesture, and dramatic timing to bring their tales to life. Jake gradually learned to appreciate the subtle layers of meaning in these stories, understanding that they served multiple purposes simultaneously. Jake's own contributions to the evening gatherings began tentatively, with simple stories about ranch life and the challenges of raising cattle in desert country. But, as his language skills improved and his understanding of Apache narrative traditions deepened, he found ways to share more complex tales from his own culture. His descriptions of white towns and cities fascinated his listeners, who had little direct experience with the world beyond their mountain fastness. The relationship between Jake and Stone Bear evolved throughout the winter months from mutual respect to something approaching genuine friendship. The war chief was a complex man, capable of great gentleness with his own people and implacable ferocity toward his enemies. His leadership style emphasized consensus building rather than authoritarian command, and Jake watched in fascination as Stone Bear guided community discussions toward decisions that reflected the will of the entire group. Stone Bear's injuries had healed well, though he would always walk with a slight limp that reminded everyone of his encounter with the bounty hunter's trap. The chief used his recovery time to deepen his relationship with Jake, sharing knowledge about Apache history, philosophy, and military tactics that few white men had ever been privileged to learn. These conversations gave Jake insights into the Apache perspective on the ongoing conflicts with white settlers, revealing the complex motivations and deep grievances that drove the cycle of violence. The Apache view of the territorial conflicts was radically different from anything Jake had learned from white sources. Where white accounts emphasized Apache savagery and unprovoked attacks, Apache oral history told of broken treaties, murdered peace delegations, and systematic attempts to destroy their way of life. Jake began to understand that the raiding that terrified white settlers was often motivated by desperation rather than inherent violence, as traditional hunting grounds were closed and food sources destroyed by white settlement patterns. These conversations challenged many of Jake's fundamental assumptions about justice, civilization, and progress. The Apache way of life, which white society dismissed as primitive and savage, revealed itself to be a sophisticated adaptation to the harsh realities of desert and mountain survival. Their social structures, spiritual beliefs, and environmental knowledge represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom that was being swept away by the inexorable advance of white settlement. As winter deepened, Jake found himself drawn into discussions about the future of Apache resistance to white encroachment. Many of the younger warriors favored continued fighting, believing that only through strength could they preserve their independence and way of life. But others, including Stone Bear himself, were beginning to recognize that military resistance alone could not prevail against the overwhelming numbers and resources of the white expansion. The debates that filled the winter evenings were intense but respectful, with each speaker given time to present their views without interruption. Jake was initially reluctant to participate in these discussions, feeling that his presence as a white man might inhibit honest conversation. But Stone Bear encouraged him to share his perspective, arguing that understanding the white point of view was essential for making informed decisions about the future. Jake's contributions to these discussions were carefully measured, as he struggled to present white perspectives honestly without seeming to advocate for policies that would harm his Apache hosts. He tried to explain the economic and political forces that drove white expansion, the genuine fear that many settlers felt about Apache raids, and the complex mix of idealism and greed that motivated territorial policies. His goal was not to justify white actions but to help the Apache understand the mindset of their opponents. The winter months also brought unexpected challenges that tested the entire community's resilience and Jake's commitment to his new life. A severe blizzard in January trapped the village for more than a week, forcing everyone to rely on their stored supplies while enduring temperatures that dropped far below anything Jake had experienced. The Apache response to this crisis impressed him with its organization and mutual support, as families shared resources to ensure that no one suffered from cold or hunger. During the worst of the storm, Jake proved his worth to the community by using his knowledge of animal behavior to help locate horses that had wandered away from the village in search of shelter. His tracking skills, honed by years of managing cattle in difficult terrain, complemented Apache techniques to form search parties that successfully recovered the missing animals before they could freeze or fall prey to mountain predators. The experience of enduring extreme hardship alongside his Apache hosts created bonds that went beyond mere hospitality or tolerance. Jake had proven himself capable of sharing their sacrifices and contributing to their survival, earning a level of acceptance that could never have been achieved through good intentions alone. The subtle but unmistakable shift in how community members treated him told Jake that he was no longer seen as an outsider being temporarily tolerated, but as someone with a legitimate place in their society. As the worst of the winter passed and the days began to grow longer, Jake started to think about the approaching spring and his eventual return to the Double M Ranch. The prospect filled him with mixed emotions, as he had grown genuinely attached to the Apache community and the way of life he had learned to appreciate. But he also missed his father and the responsibilities he had left behind, understanding that his obligations to his own family and community had not been erased by his winter among the Apache. Stone Bear seemed to understand Jake's internal conflict without needing it explained. The war chief had his own difficult decisions to make as spring approached, knowing that the end of winter would likely bring renewed conflicts with white military forces and territorial authorities. The peaceful months in the mountain stronghold were a respite, not a permanent solution to the larger tensions that threatened to tear the territory apart. The conversations between Stone Bear and Jake took on new urgency as both men contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. The war chief spoke of his dream of finding a peaceful solution to the conflicts that had claimed so many lives on both sides, while Jake shared his growing belief that understanding between the two peoples was possible if reasonable men on both sides could find common ground. As February gave way to March and the first signs of spring appeared in the high country, the Apache community began preparing for the seasonal migrations that would take them to different parts of their traditional territory. These preparations were accompanied by ceremonies that honored the changing seasons and asked for guidance in the difficult times ahead. Jake participated in these rituals with the respect and reverence that had become natural to him, understanding that they were not mere superstition but genuine expressions of a worldview that saw spiritual significance in all aspects of life. The question of Jake's future became a subject of intense discussion among the Apache leadership. Some argued that he should remain with them permanently, becoming fully Apache in all but blood. Others worried that his presence might create complications with white authorities who would view any Apache band harboring a white man as inherently suspicious. Stone Bear himself was torn between his genuine affection for Jake and his responsibilities to his people's safety and welfare. The resolution came in a way that none of them had anticipated. A runner arrived at the stronghold in early March with news that would change everything. The territorial governor had issued a proclamation offering amnesty to any Apache bands that would agree to relocate to designated reservation lands. The offer came with guarantees of food, medical care, and protection from hostile white settlers, but it also meant the end of the traditional Apache way of life that Stone Bear's people had fought so hard to preserve. The news sparked the most intense debates that the village had seen all winter. The younger warriors were uniformly opposed to accepting the offer, viewing it as surrender and betrayal of their ancestors' legacy. But the elders were divided, with some arguing that continued resistance would only lead to the complete destruction of their people. The women, who had borne the hardships of constant warfare for generations, were particularly vocal in expressing their exhaustion with the cycle of violence and loss. Stone Bear found himself in an impossible position, caught between his duty to preserve Apache independence and his responsibility to ensure his people's survival. The winter conversations with Jake had given him insights into white society that made him realize the futility of continued military resistance, but accepting reservation life would mean abandoning everything that made Apache culture unique and valuable. As the debates raged through the long March evenings, Jake found himself playing an unexpected role as intermediary and counselor. His unique position as someone who understood both cultures allowed him to help Apache leaders understand the implications of their choices while providing insights into white motivations and methods that might not otherwise be available to them. The decision-making process revealed the fundamental differences between Apache and white approaches to governance. Where white society emphasized hierarchy and majority rule, Apache tradition required consensus among all stakeholders before major decisions could be implemented. This meant that every voice had to be heard and every concern addressed before Stone Bear could lead his people toward any particular course of action. Jake's growing fluency in Apache language and customs allowed him to participate more fully in these crucial discussions. His contributions were valued not because he was white, but because his winter among the Apache had given him insights into their culture that complemented his knowledge of the white world. He became a bridge between two worldviews that seemed increasingly incompatible as the pressures of the outside world intruded into the mountain sanctuary. As winter finally began to release its grip on the high country and the first flowers appeared in sheltered valleys, Jake realized that his time among the Apache was drawing to a close. The decisions that would be made in the coming weeks would determine not only his own future but the fate of Stone Bear's people and possibly the entire relationship between Apache and white cultures in the territory. The approaching spring brought not just seasonal change but the recognition that the peaceful interlude of winter was ending. Soon, the complex and dangerous world beyond the mountain stronghold would reassert its claims on all of them, and the relationships and understanding that had been built during the long, cold months would face their ultimate test in the harsh light of territorial politics and cultural conflict. Standing at the edge of the village as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Jake contemplated the transformation he had undergone during his months among the Apache. He was no longer the same man who had rescued Stone Bear from the bounty hunter's trap, and he knew that whatever path he chose in the days ahead, he would carry the lessons and relationships of this winter with him for the rest of his life. The arrival of spring in the mountain stronghold brought more than just melting snow and budding trees. It brought a delegation of territorial officials, accompanied by a small military escort, who had somehow discovered the location of Stone Bear's winter camp and come to negotiate directly with the Apache leader. Their appearance in the hidden valley sent shockwaves through the community and put Jake in an impossibly dangerous position as the only white man living among people that many of these officials considered hostile enemies. The delegation was led by Captain Marcus Webb, a career cavalry officer whose weathered face spoke of 20 years fighting Indians across the frontier. With him came Thomas Brennan, a territorial administrator whose soft hands and pale complexion marked him as a man more comfortable with ledger books than mountain trails. Most surprising of all was the presence of Father Miguel Santos, a Franciscan priest whose mission was to bring Christianity to the Apache and who served as the delegation's interpreter and cultural advisor. Jake watched from the concealment of Stone Bear's lodge as the delegation made its way up the narrow canyon that led to the village. His heart pounded as he recognized the implications of their arrival. His presence here could be interpreted as evidence of collaboration with hostile Indians, a charge that could result in court-martial proceedings if he were still considered subject to territorial military authority. More importantly, his very existence among the Apache might be seen as proof that Stone Bear's band was harboring spies or planning attacks on white settlements. Stone Bear himself remained calm as reports of the approaching delegation reached him. The war chief had been expecting something like this ever since the runner had brought news of the territorial governor's amnesty offer. He understood that the white authorities would not simply wait indefinitely for Apache bands to voluntarily surrender their freedom. Direct contact was the next logical step in a process that would ultimately force his people to choose between submission and destruction. The formal meeting between Stone Bear and the territorial delegation took place in the center of the village, with the entire community gathered to witness these historic negotiations. Jake remained hidden in Stone Bear's lodge, listening through the thin walls as Father Santos translated between Apache and English. The priest's fluency in the Apache language was impressive, suggesting years of missionary work among various tribes, but Jake could detect subtle nuances that were being lost in translation. Captain Webb's opening statement was blunt and uncompromising. He informed Stone Bear that the territorial government was prepared to offer generous terms for peaceful relocation to the San Carlos Reservation, but that continued resistance would be met with overwhelming military force. Recent reinforcements had brought troop levels in the territory to their highest point in years, and new tactics developed in campaigns against other tribes had proven devastatingly effective. Stone Bear's response was equally direct but far more diplomatic. Speaking through Father Santos, he acknowledged the military realities that Captain Webb described while pointing out that his band had committed no hostile acts during the past year. They had remained in their traditional territory, living according to their ancient customs, and had avoided all contact with white settlements. If the territorial government truly desired peace, Stone Bear argued, then peaceful Apache bands should be left unmolested. Thomas Brennan then presented the specific terms of the relocation offer, reading from official documents that outlined the provisions for Apache families who agreed to move to the reservation. The promises were generous on paper, including guaranteed food rations, medical care, education for Apache children, and protection from hostile white settlers. But Jake, listening from his hiding place, could hear the skepticism in the voices of the Apache elders who had heard similar promises before. The negotiations continued for hours, with both sides probing for weaknesses while attempting to find common ground. Captain Webb made it clear that the military option remained on the table, describing recent campaigns that had resulted in the complete destruction of Apache bands that had refused to negotiate. But he also expressed genuine respect for Stone Bear's reputation as an honorable leader, suggesting that peaceful resolution would benefit everyone involved. Father Santos played a crucial role in these discussions, not just as translator but as a mediator who understood both cultures. The priest's presence lent credibility to the territorial offer while providing a channel for communication that went beyond mere military threats. His obvious concern for Apache welfare helped to soften the harsh realities that Captain Webb was compelled to present. As the first day of negotiations drew to a close, Jake realized that his secret presence in the village was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The territorial delegation would be staying overnight, and their soldiers were already establishing a camp that would make movement around the village much more challenging. More critically, Jake understood that his knowledge of both the Apache position and the territorial offer made him a valuable asset to both sides, a role that could easily become impossibly conflicted. The decision to reveal himself came when he overheard a private conversation between Captain Webb and Thomas Brennan that made it clear they suspected Apache bands of harboring white deserters or outlaws. The officials were discussing the possibility of searching the village for evidence of such collaboration, a development that would inevitably lead to Jake's discovery and could provide justification for harsher measures against Stone Bear's people. Jake's emergence from Stone Bear's lodge created a sensation that rippled through both the Apache community and the territorial delegation. Captain Webb's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he recognized Jake as clearly not a military deserter or common criminal. The Apache, for their part, watched tensely to see how their white guest would handle this confrontation with his own people. The explanation that followed was one of the most challenging conversations of Jake's life. He had to account for his presence among the Apache without revealing information that could compromise Stone Bear's security, while also demonstrating to the territorial officials that he had not been coerced or converted to hostility against white interests. The delicate balance required careful attention to every word, as both sides were looking for evidence to support their pre-existing assumptions. Captain Webb's questioning was professional but thorough, clearly attempting to determine whether Jake represented a security threat or intelligence asset. The officer's military experience had taught him to be suspicious of unusual circumstances, and a white rancher living voluntarily among hostile Indians was certainly unusual. Jake's explanations of how he had come to be in the village and why he had remained through the winter were met with obvious skepticism. Thomas Brennan was more interested in the political implications of Jake's situation. A white man who had lived peacefully among the Apache for months could serve as powerful evidence that accommodation between the races was possible, supporting the territorial government's preference for negotiated settlement over military action. But Jake's testimony could also be seen as naive romanticism if his experience was not representative of broader Apache attitudes toward white settlers. Father Santos proved to be Jake's most sympathetic questioner, understanding from his own missionary experience the profound cultural adjustments required for meaningful cross-cultural contact. The priest's questions focused on Jake's observations about Apache religious practices, social organization, and attitudes toward Christianity. These conversations revealed the depth of Jake's integration into Apache society while demonstrating his continued loyalty to his own cultural values. The revelation of Jake's presence added a new dimension to the negotiations, as both Stone Bear and the territorial delegation recognized the unique perspective he could provide. Captain Webb saw an opportunity to gather intelligence about Apache capabilities and intentions from someone who had observed them closely. Stone Bear, meanwhile, recognized that Jake's testimony could help white officials understand Apache motivations and grievances that had never been effectively communicated before. Jake found himself serving as an informal mediator in discussions that became increasingly complex as each side sought to use his presence to advance their own objectives. His unique position allowed him to translate not just words but concepts, helping Apache leaders understand the political pressures that drove territorial policy while explaining to white officials the cultural values that made reservation life so abhorrent to traditional Apache. The second day of negotiations brought the introduction of a new and unexpected element into the discussions. Among the Apache who had gathered to observe the historic meeting was a young woman named Morningstar, Stone Bear's eldest daughter, whose intelligence and strong will had made her one of her father's most trusted advisors. Jake had noticed her during his months in the village, admiring from a respectful distance her grace and dignity, but the formal nature of their limited interactions had prevented any deeper relationship from developing. Morningstar's participation in the negotiations was unprecedented, as Apache women traditionally did not involve themselves directly in political discussions with outsiders. But her deep understanding of white culture, gained through careful observation and questioning of Jake during the winter months, made her insights valuable to her father's decision-making process. Her presence also added a personal dimension to the negotiations that neither side had anticipated. Jake became aware of Morningstar's special attention during a break in the formal discussions, when she approached him with questions about the territorial officials' true intentions. Her English, while limited, was sufficient for basic communication, and Jake found himself drawn into a conversation that went far beyond political matters. Morningstar's intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond Apache lands had made her one of Jake's most attentive students during the winter months, and their shared interest in building understanding between cultures had created a connection that neither had fully acknowledged. The attraction between Jake and Morningstar had been building slowly throughout the winter, but the formal constraints of Apache society had prevented either from acting on their feelings. Apache courtship customs were complex and highly regulated, requiring family approval and elaborate ceremonies before relationships could progress beyond casual friendship. The presence of the territorial delegation, however, had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made traditional constraints seem less relevant. Their growing relationship did not go unnoticed by Stone Bear, whose protective instincts as a father were complicated by his recognition that Jake had proven himself to be a man of honor and integrity. The war chief found himself facing an impossible choice between his desire to see his daughter happy and his responsibility to preserve Apache traditions that discouraged marriage outside the tribe. The political implications of such a union added another layer of complexity to an already difficult decision. Captain Webb and Thomas Brennan observed the developing relationship between Jake and Morningstar with great interest, recognizing its potential value in their negotiations with Stone Bear. A marriage between a white man and an Apache woman would create family bonds that could serve as a foundation for broader peace between the races. But such a union would also create complications for territorial policy, which generally discouraged intimate relationships between whites and Indians as threats to racial purity and social order. Father Santos viewed the situation through the lens of his missionary calling, seeing an opportunity to bring Christianity to a prominent Apache family while demonstrating the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different peoples. The priest's enthusiasm for such a union was tempered by his understanding of the practical difficulties it would create for both Jake and Morningstar, who would face suspicion and hostility from members of both communities. The formal negotiations continued for several more days, with both sides gradually moving toward a framework for agreement. Stone Bear's band would relocate to a designated area near the San Carlos Reservation but would retain certain traditional rights and customs that were typically forbidden to reservation Indians. In exchange, they would accept territorial authority and agree to serve as intermediaries with other Apache bands that remained hostile to white settlement. Jake's role in these negotiations evolved from reluctant participant to active mediator, as both sides came to rely on his unique perspective and cultural knowledge. His months among the Apache had given him insights into their concerns and motivations that no other white man possessed, while his obvious commitment to peaceful resolution made him acceptable to territorial officials who might otherwise have viewed any Apache sympathizer with suspicion. The breakthrough in negotiations came when Jake proposed a radical solution to the problem of Apache resistance to reservation life. Instead of forcing traditional hunters and warriors to become farmers overnight, why not establish a program that would allow Apache men to serve as scouts and guides for territorial forces? Their unmatched knowledge of the landscape and tracking skills would be valuable assets in campaigns against truly hostile bands, while providing them with a role that maintained their warrior traditions in modified form. The proposal was controversial on both sides, with some Apache viewing it as collaboration with their oppressors while some territorial officials saw it as arming potential enemies. But Stone Bear recognized the wisdom in Jake's suggestion, understanding that it offered his people a way to maintain their dignity while adapting to the new realities of territorial control. Captain Webb, meanwhile, appreciated the military value of Apache scouts who could provide intelligence and tracking capabilities that no white soldier possessed. As the negotiations moved toward resolution, the question of Jake's future became increasingly pressing. His unique position as the only white man trusted by both sides made him valuable to the territorial government, which offered him a position as liaison between Apache scouts and military commanders. Stone Bear, meanwhile, formally invited Jake to remain with his band as a permanent member of their community, an honor that carried both privileges and obligations under Apache law. The decision was complicated by Jake's growing relationship with Morningstar, which had deepened despite the constraints of their situation. Their conversations during breaks in the negotiations had revealed a compatibility of minds and spirits that transcended cultural differences. Both were intelligent, curious individuals who shared a passion for building understanding between their peoples, and their mutual attraction had grown into something approaching love. Morningstar's own feelings were evident to anyone who observed her interactions with Jake, though Apache customs prevented her from expressing them directly. Her father noticed the change in his daughter's demeanor when Jake was present, the way her eyes followed him during discussions, and the careful attention she paid to his words and opinions. Stone Bear found himself facing a choice that would affect not just his daughter's happiness but the future relationship between his people and the territorial government. The resolution came in a way that surprised everyone involved. During a private meeting with Jake and his daughter, Stone Bear made a formal proposal that would address both personal and political considerations. He offered to adopt Jake as his son, a ceremony that would make him a full member of the Apache tribe with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. As Stone Bear's adopted son, Jake would be eligible to court Morningstar according to Apache customs, potentially leading to a marriage that would unite not just two individuals but two cultures. The proposal was unprecedented in Apache history, as adoption of adult outsiders was extremely rare and had never been extended to a white man. But Stone Bear argued that Jake had proven himself through his courage in rescuing a wounded enemy, his willingness to live according to Apache customs during the winter months, and his role in facilitating peaceful negotiations with territorial authorities. The war chief's endorsement carried enormous weight within the community, though the final decision would require approval from the tribal council. Jake's response to Stone Bear's proposal was both honored and conflicted. Accepting adoption would mean abandoning his birth family and the ranch that represented his father's life work. But refusing might mean losing any chance for a future with Morningstar while potentially damaging the delicate peace negotiations that could determine the fate of Stone Bear's people. The decision would require him to choose between two worlds that he had come to value equally. The tribal council meeting that would decide Jake's fate was scheduled for the evening after the territorial delegation departed, giving both sides time to consider the implications of what was being proposed. Captain Webb and Thomas Brennan were briefed on the situation and asked for their official response to the possibility of a white man becoming a formal member of an Apache band through adoption and marriage. The territorial officials' reaction was mixed, reflecting the complex racial and political considerations involved. From a practical standpoint, Jake's position as Stone Bear's adopted son would make him an invaluable liaison between Apache scouts and military commanders. His dual loyalty would ensure that both sides' interests were represented and protected. But, from a policy perspective, official recognition of such a union would set precedents that could complicate future dealings with other tribes. Father Santos was enthusiastic about the proposed adoption and marriage, seeing it as validation of his belief that Christianity and civilization could triumph over racial differences through love and understanding. The priest offered to perform a Christian wedding ceremony that would complement the Apache rituals, creating a union that would be recognized by both cultures and blessed by God. As the territorial delegation prepared to depart, Captain Webb made a formal statement regarding the government's position on Jake's situation. The military would not object to his adoption by Stone Bear or his marriage to Morningstar, provided that his primary loyalty remained with territorial authority and that he fulfill his obligations as a liaison between Apache scouts and military forces. This qualified approval was the best that could be hoped for under the circumstances. The departure of the territorial delegation left the village in a state of nervous anticipation as the Apache leadership prepared for the tribal council meeting that would determine not just Jake's future but the direction of their entire community. The negotiations had established a framework for peace, but implementing that agreement would require difficult decisions from people who had never compromised their independence to any external authority. Jake spent the day before the council meeting in quiet reflection, walking alone through the mountain forests where he had learned to see the world through Apache eyes. The approaching decision would force him to choose between two identities, two loyalties, and two ways of life that had shaped him in different but equally important ways. Whatever choice he made would close off possibilities while opening others, and he understood that there would be no way to undo the consequences of his decision. Evening shadows were lengthening across the village when the tribal council convened to consider Stone Bear's unprecedented proposal. The meeting brought together not just the band's leadership but representatives of every family, as decisions of this magnitude required community consensus. Jake waited outside the council lodge while his fate was debated, listening to voices raised in passionate argument but unable to understand the rapid Apache being spoken inside. Morningstar found him there as darkness fell over the mountain valley, her presence offering comfort without words. They sat together in companionable silence, both understanding that the next few hours would determine whether their growing love could overcome the cultural barriers that divided them. The weight of their people's histories and expectations pressed down on them like the cold mountain air, but their feelings for each other provided warmth against the uncertainty. The council's deliberations continued long into the night, with traditional songs and prayers punctuating the discussions as the Apache leadership sought guidance from their ancestors and the spirits of the land. Jake could hear Stone Bear's voice rising above the others at times, arguing passionately for his proposal while acknowledging the risks and uncertainties involved. The war chief was staking his reputation and authority on his belief that Jake's adoption would benefit not just his daughter but his entire people. When the council finally reached its decision near midnight, Running Wolf emerged from the lodge to summon Jake for the formal announcement. His face revealed nothing of what had been decided, maintaining the stoic expression that Apache custom required during important ceremonies. Jake rose on unsteady legs, his heart pounding as he prepared to learn whether his future lay with the Apache or required him to return to the world of his birth. The interior of the council lodge was filled with smoke from the sacred fire and the faces of men and women whose opinions would shape his destiny. Stone Bear sat in the place of honor, his expression grave but not unkind as he prepared to announce the decision that would change everything. The moment had arrived for Jake to learn whether love could truly bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. The silence in the council lodge was profound as Stone Bear rose to address the gathered Apache leadership. The sacred fire cast dancing shadows on the faces of men and women who had spent hours debating a decision that would either honor their traditions or break them forever. Jake stood before them, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited to learn whether his love for Morningstar could overcome centuries of mistrust between their peoples. Stone Bear's voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he finally spoke, his words measured and deliberate as Running Wolf translated for Jake's understanding. The tribal council had reached consensus after lengthy deliberation, weighing the unprecedented nature of the request against Jake's proven courage, integrity, and commitment to Apache welfare. The decision, Stone Bear announced, was unanimous in its support for adoption, though it came with conditions that would test Jake's resolve in ways he had never imagined. The first condition was that Jake must undergo the traditional Apache purification ceremonies that prepared a man for full tribal membership. These rituals would strip away his white identity through days of fasting, prayer, and spiritual cleansing, allowing him to be reborn as an Apache warrior. The process was both physically and emotionally demanding, designed to ensure that only those with absolute commitment could complete it successfully. The second condition addressed the political realities of Jake's unique position. As Stone Bear's adopted son and liaison with territorial authorities, he would be required to balance dual loyalties that could easily come into conflict. The council made it clear that any betrayal of Apache interests, intentional or otherwise, would result in immediate banishment and the dissolution of his adoption. His marriage to Morningstar would depend entirely on his ability to maintain the trust that the community was placing in him. The final condition was perhaps the most challenging of all. Jake would be expected to prove his worthiness as a husband to Morningstar by demonstrating his ability to provide for and protect an Apache family according to tribal customs. This meant mastering skills that went far beyond what he had learned during his winter stay, becoming proficient in all aspects of Apache warrior culture from horseback combat to the complex spiritual practices that govern daily life. Jake's acceptance of these conditions was immediate and heartfelt, though he understood that his real trials were just beginning. The adoption ceremony would take place during the next full moon, giving him 2 weeks to prepare for the transformation that would change not just his legal status but his fundamental identity. Morningstar's joy at the council's decision was evident despite the stoic expression that Apache custom required her to maintain during formal proceedings. The news of the council's decision spread quickly through the village, generating reactions that ranged from enthusiastic support to quiet skepticism. Many of the Apache had come to respect and even love Jake during his months among them, seeing in him proof that white men could learn to live according to Indian values. But others worried about the precedent being set, fearing that accepting one white man might open the door to demands for similar treatment from those whose motives were less pure. The preparation for Jake's adoption ceremony became a community effort, with different families taking responsibility for teaching him the specific skills and knowledge he would need to pass the tests ahead. Grandmother Spider, the elderly woman who had served as his cultural mentor throughout the winter, took charge of his education in Apache spiritual practices, explaining the complex relationships between the natural and supernatural worlds that govern tribal cosmology. Gray Fox, the warrior who had led Jake's first hunting expedition, became his instructor in the combat techniques that every Apache man was expected to master. The training was intense and sometimes painful, as Jake struggled to learn fighting methods that emphasized speed, agility, and cunning over the brute force tactics he had known as a white frontiersman. His progress was steady but slow, hampered by ingrained habits that conflicted with Apache approaches to warfare. Morningstar played her own crucial role in Jake's preparation, though Apache customs severely limited their interactions until after the adoption ceremony was complete. Their brief conversations, carefully chaperoned by older women, focused on the expectations and responsibilities of Apache marriage, the complex kinship obligations that would bind Jake to dozens of new relatives, and the spiritual dimensions of love that transcended mere physical attraction. During these precious moments together, Jake began to understand the depth of commitment that Morningstar was making by accepting him as her husband. As the daughter of a war chief, she could have married any Apache warrior in the territory, choosing from among men who had proven themselves in battle and demonstrated their ability to provide for families. Her choice of a white man who was still learning Apache ways represented a leap of faith that honored Jake even as it humbled him. The purification ceremonies that preceded Jake's adoption were unlike anything in his previous experience, combining physical ordeal with spiritual revelation in ways that challenged his understanding of reality itself. For 4 days and nights, he fasted and prayed in an isolated canyon sacred to the Apache, guided by medicine men who led him through visions and dreams that connected him to the spiritual forces governing tribal life. The visions that came to Jake during his purification were both terrifying and beautiful, showing him glimpses of Apache history and destiny that white men had never been privileged to witness. He saw the arrival of his own people through Apache eyes, understanding for the first time the full magnitude of loss and displacement that white settlement had brought to the indigenous peoples of the Southwest. But he also saw possibilities for healing and reconciliation that could emerge if men of goodwill on both sides were willing to bridge the cultural divide. When Jake emerged from his purification retreat, he was physically weakened but spiritually transformed in ways that even he could not fully comprehend. The Apache who greeted his return noted subtle changes in his bearing and expression, as if the man who had entered the sacred canyon was not quite the same as the one who had emerged. The purification had worked its intended effect, stripping away layers of white conditioning to reveal something deeper and more universal beneath. The adoption ceremony itself took place on the night of the full moon, with the entire Apache community gathered to witness Jake's formal rebirth as Stone Bear's son. The ritual was ancient beyond memory, its origins lost in the mists of tribal prehistory, but its power to transform was as strong as it had been for countless generations. Jake knelt before Stone Bear as the warchief spoke the words that would make them father and son according to Apache law, cutting his own palm to mix their blood in the sacred bond of kinship. The moment when Stone Bear placed his hands on Jake's head and spoke his new Apache name was one of the most profound in either man's life. Jake Morrison ceased to exist in that instant, replaced by Walks Between Worlds, a name that acknowledged his unique position as a bridge between two cultures while establishing his place within Apache society. The transformation was both symbolic and real, marking Jake's passage from one identity to another in ways that could never be undone. The celebration that followed the adoption ceremony lasted until dawn, with the entire village participating in dances and songs that welcomed their newest member while honoring the courage it had taken to accept him. Jake found himself overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection and support from people who had become his family in the truest sense of the word. The loneliness that had haunted him during his early months among the Apache was finally banished by the warm embrace of complete belonging. Morningstar's role in the celebration was necessarily limited by Apache customs that regulated interactions between unmarried men and women, but her joy was evident to everyone present. The successful completion of Jake's adoption meant that their courtship could now proceed according to traditional patterns, with formal negotiations between families and elaborate ceremonies that would culminate in their marriage. The prospect filled both of them with anticipation and nervous excitement as they contemplated the challenges and blessings that lay ahead. The courtship process that followed Jake's adoption was a masterpiece of Apache social engineering, designed to ensure that marriages were based on compatibility, mutual respect, and family support rather than mere romantic attraction. Jake found himself subjected to intensive evaluation by Morningstar's extended family, who tested everything from his hunting abilities to his understanding of kinship obligations. The process was thorough and sometimes intimidating, but it also provided him with a network of relationships that would support their marriage through whatever difficulties might arise. Stone Bear's role in the courtship was both protective and encouraging, as he sought to ensure his daughter's happiness while maintaining his authority as warchief and adoptive father. The unusual circumstances of Jake's adoption had created unprecedented situations that required careful navigation to avoid giving offense to traditional sensibilities. Stone Bear's wisdom and diplomatic skills were tested as he balanced respect for Apache customs with recognition of the unique nature of his daughter's chosen partner. The formal proposal of marriage came after 6 weeks of courtship, presented according to Apache customs that required Jake to demonstrate his worthiness through gifts, services, and public displays of his skills as a hunter and warrior. The ceremony was elaborate and beautiful, with Jake offering horses, weapons, and furs to Morningstar's family while reciting carefully rehearsed speeches that declared his intentions and promised his devotion. Morningstar's acceptance was given according to traditional forms, but the emotion in her voice as she spoke the ritual words moved everyone present to tears. The marriage ceremony itself was planned for the spring equinox, a time of balance and renewal that the Apache considered especially auspicious for new unions. The weeks of preparation involved the entire community, as families competed to provide the finest decorations, foods, and entertainment for what promised to be the most memorable wedding in tribal history. Morningstar's wedding dress was a masterpiece of Apache artistry, decorated with beadwork and quillwork that told the story of her lineage and accomplishments. Jake's wedding attire was equally magnificent, combining traditional Apache garments with symbolic elements that acknowledged his unique status as a man who belonged to both cultures. The wedding shirt that Morningstar made for him was decorated with designs that honored both Apache and white heritage, creating something entirely new that reflected their unprecedented union. The garment would become a family heirloom, passed down through generations as a reminder of the courage it had taken to unite two worlds. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with spring flowers blooming throughout the mountain valley and the air filled with the sounds of celebration. Apache families had traveled from across the territory to witness this historic union, bringing gifts and good wishes for the couple who had dared to love across cultural boundaries. The gathering was the largest that the Hidden Valley had ever hosted, transforming the winter stronghold into a festival ground that echoed with laughter and song. Father Santos had returned from his mission headquarters to perform a Christian blessing that would complement the Apache ceremonies, understanding that the marriage needed to be recognized by both cultures to achieve its full symbolic importance. The priest's presence added a dimension of religious legitimacy that satisfied those Apache who had converted to Christianity while demonstrating white recognition of the union's validity. The Apache wedding ceremony was a complex ritual that lasted most of the day, with different phases marking the couple's progression from individual identities to unified partnership. Jake and Morningstar exchanged vows that bound them not just to each other but to their respective families and communities, creating networks of obligation and support that would sustain their marriage through whatever challenges might arise. The beauty and solemnity of the proceedings moved even hardened warriors to tears as they witnessed love triumphing over prejudice and fear. The moment when Stone Bear formally gave his daughter to his adopted son was charged with emotion that transcended cultural boundaries. The war chief's speech acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the union while expressing his confidence that love and understanding could overcome any obstacle. His blessing carried special weight because of his status as both Apache leader and Jake's adoptive father, creating bonds that united not just two individuals but entire communities. The Christian ceremony that followed was equally moving, with Father Santos speaking in both Apache and English as he blessed the union according to Catholic rites. The priest's words emphasized the universal nature of love and the possibility of harmony between different peoples when they were united by common faith and mutual respect. The dual religious ceremonies created a marriage that was recognized by both cultures and blessed by both sets of spiritual beliefs. The wedding feast that followed was a celebration unlike any the Mountain Valley had ever witnessed, with traditional Apache foods prepared alongside dishes that honored Jake's white heritage. The fusion of culinary traditions created new flavors and combinations that delighted the assembled guests while symbolizing the blending of cultures that the marriage represented. The feast continued long into the night, with storytelling, dancing, and music that celebrated not just the union of two individuals but the possibility of peace between their peoples. As Jake and Morningstar began their new life together, they faced challenges that went far beyond the normal adjustments of married couples. Their union was watched closely by both Apache and white communities, with supporters and critics on both sides ready to judge their success or failure as evidence for or against the possibility of cross-cultural harmony. The pressure was enormous, but their love for each other provided strength to face whatever obstacles might arise. The first test of their marriage came sooner than expected, when territorial authorities requested Jake's assistance in negotiating with Apache bands that remained hostile to white settlement. His unique status as both Stone Bear's son and a white liaison made him the obvious choice for such delicate missions, but the work would require him to travel extensively and potentially place himself in danger. Morningstar's support for his acceptance of these responsibilities demonstrated her understanding of the larger purposes their marriage was meant to serve. The success of Jake's diplomatic missions began to establish his reputation as a peacemaker whose unique perspective could bridge seemingly impossible cultural divides. His ability to speak both Apache and English with equal fluency, combined with his intimate knowledge of both cultures, made him invaluable in negotiations that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. The territorial government officially recognized his position as Indian agent for the Apache bands, giving him authority to make agreements that would be honored by white law. Morningstar's role in these diplomatic efforts was less visible but equally important, as she used her connections within Apache society to build support for peaceful solutions to conflicts with white settlers. Her status as Stone Bear's daughter and Jake's wife gave her influence that she wielded skillfully on behalf of mutual understanding. The couple became a team whose combined efforts achieved results that neither could have accomplished alone. The birth of their first child, a son they named David in honor of Jake's grandfather and Little Wolf according to Apache tradition, marked a new chapter in their lives and the relationship between their peoples. The child was celebrated by both communities as living proof that love could transcend racial boundaries while creating something beautiful and new. His dual heritage made him a symbol of hope for those who believed in the possibility of a peaceful future. As the years passed, Jake and Morningstar's marriage became a model for other cross-cultural relationships that began to develop as Apache scouts worked alongside white soldiers and traders.
Their example showed that such unions could be successful when based on mutual respect, cultural understanding, and shared commitment to peace. The prejudices and suspicions that had initially greeted their marriage gradually gave way to acceptance and even admiration as their relationship proved its strength and durability. The Double M Ranch became a frequent meeting place for Apache and white leaders seeking to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than violence. Samuel Morrison, who had initially opposed his son's decision to live among the Apache, became one of the strongest supporters of cross-cultural cooperation as he witnessed the positive results of Jake's diplomatic work. The ranch served as neutral ground where both sides could meet safely to discuss their differences and find common solutions. Stone Bear's transformation from war chief to peace advocate was one of the most remarkable developments in territorial history, demonstrating that even the most committed warriors could embrace different paths when convinced that fighting was no longer serving their people's interests. His advocacy for cooperation with white authorities was crucial in persuading other Apache bands to consider peaceful alternatives to constant warfare. The Apache Scouts program that Jake had proposed during the original negotiations became one of the most successful initiatives in territorial history, providing meaningful employment for Apache warriors while giving military forces the tracking and reconnaissance capabilities they needed to maintain peace. The program demonstrated that former enemies could work together effectively when their different skills were valued and utilized appropriately. Jake's work as Indian agent required him to travel throughout the Southwest, mediating disputes and establishing treaties that protected Apache rights while addressing white settlers' security concerns. His reputation for fairness and integrity made him trusted by both sides, allowing him to broker agreements that might have been impossible under other circumstances. The territorial governor publicly credited Jake's efforts with preventing what could have been years of costly warfare. Morningstar's contributions to these peace efforts were recognized when she was invited to address the territorial legislature about Apache perspectives on white settlement and the possibilities for mutual coexistence. Her eloquent speech, delivered in fluent English she had learned from Jake, challenged many stereotypes about Apache women while demonstrating the intelligence and dignity of her people. The standing ovation she received marked a historic moment in territorial politics. The education of their children became a symbol of the broader possibilities for cultural integration, as David and his younger siblings learned to move seamlessly between Apache and white worlds. They were equally comfortable in traditional Apache ceremonies and white schools, speaking both languages fluently while understanding the values and customs of both cultures. Their success demonstrated that dual heritage could be a source of strength rather than confusion. The legacy of Jake and Morningstar's marriage extended far beyond their own lives, inspiring other cross-cultural relationships and demonstrating the possibility of harmony between peoples who had been enemies for generations. Their story became part of territorial folklore, told and retold as evidence that love and understanding could overcome even the deepest prejudices and most entrenched conflicts. As Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from a simple cattle rancher to a respected diplomat and family man, he marveled at the unexpected paths that life could take. The rescue of a trapped Apache warrior had led to experiences and relationships he could never have imagined, transforming not just his own life but the lives of countless others who benefited from the peace his marriage had helped to establish. Morningstar's own reflections on their life together emphasized the courage it had taken for both of them to love across cultural boundaries while remaining true to their respective heritages. Their marriage had required constant negotiation and adjustment, but it had also provided them with a richness of experience that neither culture alone could have offered. They had truly learned to walk between worlds, finding strength in their differences while celebrating their common humanity. The mountain stronghold where their love had first bloomed continued to serve as a refuge and meeting place for Apache families and white visitors who sought to understand and learn from each other. The valley had become a symbol of the possibility of peaceful coexistence, attracting visitors from across the nation who wanted to witness firsthand the success of cross-cultural cooperation. Stone Bear's final years were marked by pride in his daughter's happiness and the role his decision to adopt Jake had played in bringing peace to the territory. The old war chief's wisdom in recognizing the potential for love to bridge cultural divides had proven prophetic, establishing his reputation as a visionary leader who had chosen healing over hatred when the choice mattered most. As the sun set over the Red Rocks of Arizona Territory on the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Jake and Morningstar stood together watching their children play in the same mountain meadows where their own courtship had unfolded.
The peace they had helped to build was not perfect, and challenges remained, but their love had proven that the barriers between peoples were not insurmountable when approached with courage, patience, and genuine respect for the dignity of all human beings. Their story became a testament to the transformative power of love and the possibility of redemption even in the midst of conflict and misunderstanding. The cowboy who had rescued a trapped Apache warrior had found something far more valuable than he had ever imagined, while the Apache princess who had dared to love across cultural boundaries had helped to heal wounds that had festered for generations. Together, they had written a new chapter in the history of the American West, proving that even the deepest divisions could be bridged when people were willing to see beyond their differences to the common humanity that united them all.